Now, throughout your journey as an iOS developer, inevitably you will come across user defaults, and you'll probably use it in quite a few of your projects because it's really simple to use, very flexible, and doesn't take very many lines of code. Now, let's have a look at some of the things that you can do with user defaults. Let's establish a default and we'll call it. Now remember, when you create property names or variable names, you can't call it certain words like default or class. And you can tell because it highlights it in a different color, in this sort of pinkish color, that tells you that this is a keyword that's reserved for certain users. So let's create a new user default called defaults, and we'll set it to equal UserDefaults.standard. And let's see what are some of the things that we can set into our user defaults. So we can write something like set URL for key, set value, which is type optional any for key. So we can use optionals. We can set booleans, doubles, floats, integers. So one of the scenarios that you might find yourself using user defaults is saving user preferences inside your app. So for example, if you had an app where you allow the user to set the music volume, you might say something like set 0.24 for key volume. And that means that at a later date, you can say let volume equals defaults dot float for key volume. Then you can use that persisted data for volume to always set your games or your app's volume to 0.24, which is what the user prefers. Now, aside from floats, you can also use set on booleans. So for example, we'll set true for the key music on, so that every time they open up your game, you always have the music on or the music off, depending on their preference. And there's a whole bunch of other ones I'm just going to quickly run through. So you can obviously set strings, right? So for example, you might have player name. You can also track user behavior by using defaults like set use any. We'll use the current date by just tapping into a new object of date, and the key is going to be app last opened by user. And you can see that when you try to retrieve this, let app last open equals defaults dot object. Now we're using object because we're not trying to grab a float, an int, or a string. We're trying to grab something that was saved using optional any. So we should try and get back using the method that grabs us an optional of any data type. So let's hit object for key, and I'm just going to paste that incredibly long key into here. And now you can see that app last open is set to equal the time when this default was set. And of course, every single time I run the app, it's going to change that time just by a little bit. Cool, so we've seen some pretty standard data types being saved. Now, if you want to get really fancy with your defaults, you can also save collections like let array equal 1, 2, 3. And we can say defaults set value of optional any to array. And for key, let's call it my array. And there's a special method that allows you to get that array back by using defaults dot array for key string, and it's going to be my array. Now you can either let Swift infer what's the data type of the objects contained inside the array, because if you option click on this array here, you can see that when we use defaults to retrieve an array out of user defaults, the return type is actually an optional array, and it doesn't know what is the data type that's contained inside the array. So if you want to be more explicit, you can downcast the array into an array of integers. And we can do that safely because we saved it here, and we should know what the data type is that went into that default for the key my array. And similarly, you can do the same thing for dictionaries. And let's just say let dictionary equal name, modular and we'll say defaults.set. And of course we're using any again, and we're going to put dictionary, our dictionary in there, and we'll call it my dictionary. And then we can retrieve it over here by using defaults.dictionary. And we'll put the key back in. Now, the spelling of your keys matter a great deal. And if you get the case wrong, or if you spell it even slightly wrong, it's probably going to crash your program. So it's usually a good idea to create a constant at the top when you're trying to access these things, like for example, dictionary key. And we'll set it to equal my dictionary. So that way, instead of putting my dictionary as a string in all of these places, you can simply use your dictionary key in all the places where you need to access it. And this way, if you do need to change your key, then you can do it in one place. And also, if you do have any errors, it's much easier to trace and debug. All right, so that's a little bit of an overview of user defaults and what you can do with them. As you can see, they're really flexible, really adaptable, and that's one of the reasons why they're prone to abuse. Now, you should only really be using user defaults to persist small bits of data, anything that's a few kilobytes, like a volume here and there, or a Boolean, or maybe the player names. The danger is once you start getting into saving arrays or dictionaries, that the data starts getting really, really big, really unwieldy and unmanageable. Now, the reason why we say that is because user defaults is not a database, and it should not be used as a database. As we saw earlier on, all of these key value pairs get saved into a plist, and that entire plist of your user defaults has to be loaded up synchronously, so all of it gets loaded up before you can access any of the values contained inside the keys. So that means that if you're looking for something really small, like the volume that was saved, which is going to be just 0.24, which is a very small piece of data, even to grab that small piece of data, your iPhone or your simulator or whatever device you're running your app on has to load up the entire user defaults plist. So everything that you store in it has to be loaded up. And that means that it can be very time consuming if you start saving large bits of data in there. And certainly across the internet, you'll come across various implementations on Stack Overflow or GitHub where people are basically trying to use user defaults as a database. But just keep in mind, it's not a database and it shouldn't be used as one, because it's going to have significant impact on the efficiency and the speed of your app. Now, one of the things that people always find really mysterious about user defaults is, how is it possible that I can simply use user defaults across all classes and objects and I still get back the same item? And the reason for this is because it's quite special. It's what's known as a singleton. And in the next lesson, I want to show you what singletons are, and it'll go some of the way towards understanding how user defaults actually works. So I'll see you there.